July 5, 1943. Ponyri Station, Northern Kursk Salient. A single T-34 sat hull down in a shallow ravine. Its gun trained on a tree line 400 meters to the northwest. Inside, Senior Lieutenant Yosef Kravchenko, 31 years old, former tractor mechanic from Kharkiv, a man his own battalion commander had twice recommended be reassigned to logistics. His orders were to hold the junction until reinforcements arrived. No timeline given, no support confirmed, no second tank. To the northwest, the 9th Panzer Division, 270 armored vehicles, was already moving. They thought one tank couldn't hold that line. What happened in the next 11 hours would not appear in the official Soviet operational summary until 1947. But before we get to what Kravchenko did that day, we need to understand who he actually was, because the record almost never mentioned him. And that was not an accident. The file on Senior Lieutenant Yosef Kravchenko, as it existed in the spring of 1943, was not impressive by the standards of the 307th Rifle Division's Armored Attachment. It listed his age, 31. His rank, Senior Lieutenant, a grade that men 5 years younger had already passed through on their way to captain. His assignment, Tank Commander, 3rd Company, Attached Armored Support Element, Central Front. His pre-war occupation, Heavy Equipment Operator, Kharkiv Tractor Plant. Number 183, that last line was the one his fellow officers noticed most. Not because it was unusual for a Soviet tanker to come from industrial labor. Many did, but because Kravchenko had not come through the standard military academies. He had not studied at Kazan or Ulyanovsk. He had not written tactical papers. He had not trained under officers who wrote tactical papers. He had learned to drive, repair, and push machinery to its operational limit inside a factory that built the same vehicles he now commanded in the field. In the hierarchy of the Red Army's Armored Corps in 1943, that background placed him precisely nowhere. He had received his commission in 1941, not through selection, but through attrition. The losses at Barbarossa had emptied the officer pipeline so completely that men with mechanical competence and a functional pulse were handed ranks and told to perform. Kravchenko performed. But performing under emergency conditions and performing under evaluation are two different things. And the officers who assessed him in 1942 noted what they saw. A man who was difficult to read, who asked questions that weren't on the curriculum, and who had a habit of requesting topographical maps for sectors outside his assigned patrol area. One assessment from October 1942 described him as technically proficient, tactically unconventional, not recommended for independent command. That phrase, not recommended for independent command, followed him forward. His battalion commander, Major Alexei Rudenko, was not a cruel man. He was an efficient one. And efficiency, in the context of Soviet armored doctrine in 1943, meant standardization. It meant commanders who executed the approved method in the approved sequence with the approved level of aggression. It meant men who fit the model. Kravchenko did not fit the model. He was quiet in briefings, not the quiet of a man absorbing information, his peers assumed, but the quiet of a man who wasn't following. He took longer than others to confirm orders. He asked, on more than one occasion, about fallback positions during advance operations. A question that, in the cultural climate of the Red Army at that time, carried an implication no officer wanted attached to his name. There was no formal ridicule. The Red Army did not operate on formal ridicule, but there was the particular silence that follows a man's question when no one in the room treats it as worth answering. There was the way his company was assigned the oldest T-34 in the battalion, the one with the worn driver's hatch seal and the gun sight, that required a manual correction of 0.3 degrees at range. There was the way his name appeared last on rotation lists for the newer model 1942 variants, consistently, without explanation. His crew knew it. They said nothing. In the spring of 1943, the entire Soviet military apparatus was preparing for what its intelligence services had already identified as the largest armored engagement in the history of modern warfare. No one had time to concern themselves with a senior lieutenant from Kharkiv who asked too many questions about terrain. What the assessments did not record, what no assessment would have thought to record, was what Kravchenko did with his off-rotation hours. He studied ground, not maps, ground. He walked sectors his unit wasn't assigned to. He identified drainage patterns, sight lines, dead ground, the low folds in terrain that don't appear on standard military maps because they are too small to matter at the operational scale. He understood, from years of moving heavy machinery across uneven industrial lots, that ground which looks flat from above is rarely flat from inside it. He knew something about the T-34 that the academy-trained officers in his battalion also knew, but had filed differently, that a tank fighting from a prepared position, using terrain, engaging at chosen range, with a commander who understands both his vehicle's limitations and the ground beneath it, is not the same asset as a tank advancing in formation across open steppe. He had never been given the chance to demonstrate the difference. But in the first week of July 1943, the German Ninth Army began moving south, and the position at Ponyri Station needed someone willing to hold it alone. That was not considered an opportunity. It was considered a death assignment, and Kravchenko was the one they gave it to. By the morning of July 4th, the Soviet Central Front had a problem that was not appearing cleanly in its operational reports. The reports said, defensive lines holding, casualties within acceptable parameters. Enemy advance slowed along northern axis. These were accurate statements, in the narrow sense that accurate statements can still be misleading. What the reports did not capture, what the language of operational summaries was not designed to capture, was the specific texture of what was happening at the junction points, the seams between units, the places where one regiment's responsibility ended and another's began, the places where German armored commanders had learned, through 3 years of war on the Eastern Front, to apply pressure. Ponyri Station was one of those places. It sat at the northern edge of the Kursk salient, a railway junction of modest strategic value in peacetime and critical value in the context of the current battle. Control of Ponyri meant control of the rail line running south. Control of that line meant the difference between Soviet reinforcements arriving on schedule and arriving late. Arriving late in the mathematics of armored warfare was a variable that compounded. Every hour of delay multiplied the cost of the next hour. The Germans understood this. Their operational planning for Case Citadel, the assault on the Kursk salient, had identified Ponyri as a secondary penetration objective. Not the primary axis, not the main effort. A secondary objective assigned to the 9th Panzer Division as part of a broader envelopment scheme. Secondary, in German armored doctrine, did not mean unimportant. It meant relentless. The Soviet units tasked with holding the Ponyri sector had not failed through lack of effort. That distinction matters, and the record should reflect it. The 307th Rifle Division had held its primary positions through the opening day of the German offensive with significant losses and without breaking. The infantry had absorbed artillery preparation that, by artillery preparation standards, was not a preliminary action, it was an erasure. Entire company positions had been reduced to craters. Communication lines had been cut, relayed, and cut again. Officers had died in the process of doing what officers are supposed to do, and their replacements had continued. But the armored support element, the 12 T-34s assigned to reinforce the Ponyri junction, had encountered a problem that rifle courage could not solve. The approach routes to the junction were compromised. German forward observers had registered the 2 primary armor lanes into the sector within hours of the offensive opening. Both routes ran across elevated ground that offered speed and trafficability for Soviet tanks moving up, and clear observation for German anti-tank teams positioned along the western ridgeline. The first Soviet tank column to use the northern approach on the morning of July 5th lost 3 vehicles in 11 minutes. The column halted. The surviving commanders reported back. The reports confirmed what the map had already suggested to anyone willing to read it carefully. The standard approach was no longer viable. The second route, the southern lane, running along a drainage ditch that offered partial concealment, had been attempted that same afternoon by a 2-tank element. One tank threw a track in the soft ground adjacent to the ditch. The second stopped to assist. Both were destroyed by German mortar fire within 20 minutes. The mortar team had pre-plotted the position 3 days earlier. 2 routes, both closed. 6 tanks lost in under 4 hours. The battalion's response was conventional, because convention was what the battalion had. A request was submitted for air support to suppress the western ridgeline. The request was received, logged, and placed in a queue behind 47 other requests from the Central Front's operational area. Air assets were allocated by priority matrix. Ponieri, as a secondary objective sector, ranked accordingly. An artillery suppression mission was planned against the German forward observer positions. The mission was executed at 1600 hours. The observers relocated before the first round landed. They had done this before. They were good at it. A third armor approach, a wide flanking movement running 3 kilometers south before turning west, was proposed by one of the company commanders. The proposal was rejected. It would take 4 hours to execute and required crossing ground that had not been cleared of German anti-tank mines. The engineers needed to clear it were currently assigned to the primary defensive axis and could not be released. By 6 a.m. on July 5th, the junction at Ponieri had no armored support. The infantry holding the position had anti-tank rifles, determination, and a diminishing supply of both. Command needed 1 tank in that position by nightfall. 1 tank, holding 1 junction, long enough for the reinforcement column to redirect and arrive by morning. They had 1 tank available, and 1 man no one else wanted to give the assignment to. But this was just the beginning of the problem. Because what waited for Kravchenko at Ponieri wasn't a defensive engagement. It was a methodical German armored clearance operation. And it was already underway. Kravchenko received the assignment. The order was verbal. No written confirmation was issued, which was not unusual under the circumstances. Major Rudenko delivered it personally, which was. The briefing lasted 4 minutes. Kravchenko was told the junction coordinates, the last known German forward positions, and the estimated arrival window for the reinforcement column. Sometime before 0600 the following morning. He was told to hold the position. He was not told how. He was not provided additional ammunition, additional crew, or additional guidance. He was given a grid reference and a time limit and sent in the direction of both. His crew at that point consisted of 3 men. Gunner Corporal Dmitry Volkov, 24 years old, Leningrad. Loader Private Semyon Bash, 19 years old. Assignment of record. Agricultural Collective, Tambov Region. Driver Sergeant Pavel Ostrenko, 28 years old, the only other member of the crew with pre-war mechanical experience. The 4 of them had operated together since February. They had not been selected for this assignment. They had been inherited with it. Kravchenko spent 11 minutes after the briefing at the vehicle. He did not address his crew about the nature of the operation. He checked the gun sight, confirmed the 0.3 degree correction was still valid, checked the track tension on the left side, which had been running loose, and reviewed his topographical notes for the Ponieri sector. Notes he had made 6 weeks earlier, during an off-rotation afternoon, for no operationally stated reason. At 7:02 p.m. they moved out. The route Kravchenko chose was not on the battalion's approved approach list. It was not on any list. It was a shallow erosion channel running northeast from the motor pool, staging area, cutting between two low agricultural berms before descending into a dry creek bed that ran, with interruptions, to within 600 meters of the junction's southern edge. The channel was not wide enough for a T-34 by standard clearance measurements. It was wide enough for Kravchenko's T-34 because Kravchenko understood, from the 11 months he had spent moving that specific vehicle across difficult ground, that the standard clearance measurements included a margin that could be used. He used it. The left track ran within 40 centimeters of the berm wall for a stretch of approximately 200 meters. Ostrenko, the driver, did not ask about the margin. He held the line. The sky above the Kursk salient on the evening of July 5th was overcast. Cloud base approximately 800 meters. Visibility at ground level, in the fading light of a northern summer evening, was adequate for movement but degraded for precision observation. The dust generated by the day's armored activity had not yet fully settled. It hung at low levels across the open ground east of the junction, creating a visual interference layer that, from the German ridgeline positions to the west, would complicate target acquisition at ranges beyond 600 meters. Kravchenko had noted the dust pattern during the approach. He adjusted his intended final position by 80 meters, placing the tank not at the junction itself, but at the edge of the dust layer's eastern boundary. From inside the layer, looking west, visibility was acceptable. From the ridgeline looking east, his vehicle would be visually inconsistent against the particulate background at ranges beyond 500 meters. This was not a tactic found in any Soviet armored manual of the period. He reached the position at 7:41 p.m. He did not radio confirmation of arrival. Radio transmission from a stationary concealed position was a locating risk he judged unnecessary. Command would know his position when the junction was still held at 6 p.m. A German reconnaissance element, 2 armored half-tracks and a motorcycle unit, moved along the western road toward the junction. Standard probe, pre-advance confirmation of route clearance. The kind of movement that precedes a larger action by approximately 90 minutes, which Kravchenko understood because he had studied the German operational sequencing in the sector reports from the previous 2 days. Reports from outside his assigned area. Reports he had requested and been handed without anyone considering why he wanted them. He let the motorcycle unit pass. He engaged the lead half-track at 340 meters with a single round. The vehicle stopped. He traversed 4 degrees left and engaged the second half-track before the crew of the first had completed their dismount. The second vehicle left the road. The motorcycle unit did not return westward. It stopped 200 meters east of the junction and went silent. Its crew had just reported, or would shortly report, that the route was not clear. The reconnaissance had failed. The advance confirmation had not been obtained. Whatever was moving toward Ponyri from the west now had to make a decision without complete information. Kravchenko had not destroyed the reconnaissance force. He had blinded it. 2 rounds fired, junction intact, position unlocated. That was the first 11 minutes. But the Germans were not an enemy that absorbed a failed reconnaissance and waited. Within the hour, they adjusted. And what they sent next was not a probe. The Germans processed the reconnaissance failure in under 40 minutes. That pace matters. It was not the response time of a unit that had been surprised. It was the response time of a unit that had anticipated resistance, absorbed the confirmation, and moved to the next step in a pre-prepared sequence. The 9th Panzer Division had been executing armored clearance operations since the opening of Case Citadel 31 hours earlier. They had encountered Soviet defensive positions, destroyed them, bypassed them, or noted them for follow-up. They had a system. The system was functioning. What changed was the classification of the Ponyri junction in that system. Before Kravchenko's 2 rounds, the junction was listed as a probable light resistance point, infantry with anti-tank rifles, possibly a crew-served weapon. The reconnaissance failure reclassified it. 2 half-tracks taken out in under 10 seconds, with no follow-up fire, no visible muzzle flash reported by the motorcycle crew, and no sound signature consistent with an anti-tank rifle. The German forward commander who received the motorcycle crew's report understood what that pattern indicated. There was a tank in that position, a stationary tank, firing from concealment, conserving ammunition, and not broadcasting its location. That was not infantry behavior. That was a commander making deliberate choices. The forward commander noted it, adjusted his assessment, and issued new instructions. The next element moving toward Ponyri would not be a probe. It would be a suppression and fix operation, designed not to destroy the Soviet position immediately, but to locate it precisely and pin it in place, while a flanking element moved to a firing angle that removed the concealment advantage. It was a sound plan. It was what the situation called for, and it was moving before 9 p.m. Kravchenko did not know the specific content of the German response. He knew its shape. He had moved the tank 60 meters northeast of his initial firing position within 4 minutes of the engagement. Standard post-fire displacement, the kind of basic survival measure that every tank commander understood. But he also understood that the displacement had a cost. The new position was slightly outside the eastern edge of the dust layer. The concealment was reduced. The sight lines to the western approach were marginally better, but the asymmetry he had built into his initial position, visible outward, obscured inward, was partially degraded. He accepted the trade and noted its implications. German artillery began falling on the junction area, not on his position, on the junction itself, the road intersection, the rail siding, the physical infrastructure of the point he had been ordered to hold. The rounds were not precision fire. They were area suppression, designed to complicate movement and force a response. A defending commander who moved to protect the junction would reveal position. A defending commander who stayed still would watch the ground he was holding get systematically reduced. Kravchenko stayed still. The artillery ran for 19 minutes. It destroyed the rail siding's eastern signal post, cratered the road approach in 2 places, and set fire to a wooden storage structure 90 meters north of the junction. The fire introduced a new variable: light, directional, flickering, inconsistent, but enough to compromise the darkness that had been working in Kravchenko's favor since 2000 hours. The dust layer that had obscured his position was now backlit on its western edge. His concealment window was closing. Volkov, the gunner, identified movement on the northern ridgeline. Not the western approach, the northern ridgeline. A flanking element. 2 vehicles, moving without lights, using the high ground to establish an elevated firing angle that would look down into the depression where Kravchenko had positioned the tank. This was the fixed component of the German plan. The northern element wasn't there to destroy him immediately. It was there to bracket his position, to force him to choose between the western threat and the elevated northern threat simultaneously. A tank commander fighting one direction cannot effectively fight 2. The geometry of a turret is the geometry of a single solution at a time. The Germans were creating a problem that required 2 solutions at once. Kravchenko had 4 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition remaining after the initial engagement. He had 14 rounds of high explosive. The high explosive would not defeat the German vehicles at combat range. The 4 armor-piercing rounds had to cover every remaining engagement of the night. 4 rounds, 2 threats, 1 position, and the reinforcement column still 4 hours away at minimum. He had not moved the tank in 22 minutes. In the context of a fixing operation, 22 minutes of stillness was beginning to function as a located position. The margin that had existed at 1941 hours, the gap between what the Germans knew and what they needed to know, was now measurable in minutes. But the Germans had not yet accounted for one thing. Kravchenko wasn't defending the junction. He was defending the idea that the junction was defended. And those are not the same problem. What came next wasn't a fighting retreat. It was something the German forward commander would later describe, in his own after-action notes, as deeply uncharacteristic of Soviet armor doctrine. At 9:47 p.m., Kravchenko made a decision that was not in the manual. He fired at the northern ridgeline, not at the vehicles. At the ground in front of them, a high explosive round that landed 30 meters short of the lead vehicle's position on the downslope face of the ridgeline. The round did no meaningful damage. It was not intended to. It was intended to produce a muzzle flash visible from the western approach, at a position 140 meters southwest of where the tank actually sat. He had fired from the edge of a shallow fold in the ground, a position he had identified during his pre-deployment terrain study, and reached in the 4 minutes between his last movement and the German artillery opening. The fold was not on any map. It was a drainage feature, 8 months dry, approximately 1.4 meters deep, and wide enough for the tank's hull with the gun traversed hard left. From the western approach, at night, against a backlit dust layer, the muzzle flash would appear to originate from open ground. From the northern ridgeline, the angle was wrong for accurate observation. He had just told 2 separate German elements that his tank was somewhere it was not. He moved again immediately, 60 meters east, back into the dust layer's remaining shadow. He was now 200 meters from his original position, 140 meters from the false position, and still within effective engagement range of both approach vectors. Volkov, the gunner, said nothing during any of this. He had learned in 11 months that Kravchenko's silences were instructions. The western approach responded to the muzzle flash. 2 German Panzer IVs moved forward along the road, closing on the false position at combat speed, approximately 25 kilometers per hour, which on a cratered road at night was faster than it should have been. The speed indicated confidence. They believed they had a fix. A tank that fires high explosive at a flanking element is a tank that is managing 2 threats and running low on armor-piercing ammunition. The German forward commander had made a logical inference. His tanks were moving to exploit it. The logic was correct. The location was not. Kravchenko let them close to 280 meters. At 280 meters, a T-34's 76mm gun, firing armor-piercing ammunition at a Panzer IV, is not a contest of equals. The Panzer IV's frontal armor at that range is a variable with a known solution. Kravchenko had 2 armor-piercing rounds allocated to the western threat. He used the first at 280 meters on the lead vehicle, targeting the junction of the hull and turret ring, a structural point, not a center mass shot. A center mass shot at that range would likely penetrate. A turret ring shot would definitely stop the vehicle and potentially prevent the turret from functioning, even if the crew survived. The vehicle stopped. The turret did not rotate again. He held the second round. The trailing Panzer IV braked. It had just watched its lead vehicle die at a range and from a direction that did not correspond to the reported muzzle flash. The crew was now operating with a targeting solution that had just been proven wrong, at night, with a Soviet tank somewhere in the dust ahead of them that had demonstrated it would wait before firing. Waiting, in that context, is its own weapon. The northern ridgeline element did not advance after the false muzzle flash. They had observed the engagement on the western approach and updated their assessment. The Soviet tank was not in the position indicated by the flash. It was somewhere in the 200-meter arc, east of the junction, inside the dust layer, and it had just reduced the western element from 2 vehicles to 1 functional vehicle in a single round. They began moving laterally along the ridgeline, seeking an angle that would let them look down into the dust layer from a different position. It was a sound adjustment. It was also slow because the ridgeline terrain at night did not permit speed without noise, and noise invited targeting. Kravchenko could hear them. The trailing Panzer IV on the western approach had not retreated. It had stopped at 310 meters and was sitting with its engine at idle, a crew waiting for information before committing. A stationary tank at 310 meters is a target. It is also bait. If Kravchenko fired his last armor-piercing round at the stationary vehicle, he would produce a muzzle flash, spend his final precision round, and face the northern ridgeline element with 14 high-explosive rounds and no further ability to kill armor. He had one armor-piercing round remaining. 2 armored threats. A reinforcement column still minimum 3 hours out. This was the problem the German forward commander had designed. 2 threats, 1 solution, geometry working against the defender. Kravchenko did not fire at the stationary Panzer IV. He fired his last armor-piercing round into the storage structure that had been burning since the artillery phase, the one 90 meters north of the junction. The round entered the burning structure and exited through its northern wall, producing a secondary ignition in the remaining timber. The fire expanded. The light expanded with it. The northern ridgeline, which had been operating in relative darkness, was now partially illuminated from below. The ridgeline element stopped moving. A crew that has just been lit up from below, on an elevated position, facing a Soviet tank commander who has demonstrated he does not fire without purpose. That crew does not advance. It reassesses. The trailing Panzer IV on the western approach remained stationary. It was now facing a junction defended by a tank that had spent its armor-piercing ammunition and was still controlling the engagement. Both German elements had stopped. Neither had a clean solution. And Kravchenko, with no armor-piercing rounds remaining, had just turned a last resort fire into a tactical instrument. The Hunter had options that 1 tank and 14 options that 1 tank and 14 high-explosive rounds could not answer forever. What happened next wasn't a tactical adjustment. It was the decision that either saved the junction or ended the night. At 10:30 p.m., the western approach went quiet. Not the quiet of withdrawal, the quiet of reorganization. There is a difference, and Kravchenko understood it. Withdrawal produces specific sounds. Engines increasing in RPM, vehicle noise moving away from the contact point. The particular acoustic signature of tracked vehicles turning on hard ground. Reorganization produces stillness. Deliberate, managed stillness. The kind that precedes a coordinated action rather than ending one. The trailing Panzer IV had not moved in 19 minutes. The northern ridgeline element had gone silent 11 minutes. Earlier, the junction area, which had been under direct or indirect pressure since 2017 hours, was now in a pocket of managed silence that had the shape of a decision being made at a level above the vehicle commanders. Kravchenko noted the time. He noted the silence. He did not interpret it as relief. He had 14 high-explosive rounds, no armor-piercing, a gun sight requiring manual correction, and a burning structure to his north that was providing more ambient light than he wanted. His position inside the dust layer's shadow was still partially valid, but the fire's spread over the previous 40 minutes had altered the light geometry of the entire junction area. What had been a reliable concealment condition at 1941 hours was now a degraded one, not eliminated, degraded. The difference between those two conditions was measured in the confidence of whoever was planning the next German move. He assessed the situation without the benefit of radio contact, aerial observation, or intelligence from adjacent units. He assessed it from what he could hear, what he could see, and what the pattern of the last 2 hours told him about the decision-making process on the other side of the darkness. What the pattern told him was this: the German forward commander was not confused. He was sequencing. The silence was a preparation interval. The two visible elements, the stationary Panzer IV to the west and the ridgeline unit to the north, were not the primary threat in the next phase. They were the fixed components of a three-point solution the German commander was assembling. 2 known points of pressure, 1 unknown point of entry. Kravchenko had been thinking about the southern approach since 10 p.m. The southern approach to the junction ran along the same drainage channel he had used for his own entry. He knew its dimensions, its surface conditions, its concealment profile. He had used it because it was not on the approved approach list, which meant it was also not on the German pre-registered target list. That advantage had been his for 3 hours. But a German forward commander who had now spent 2 hours failing to locate and fix a Soviet tank through the standard western and northern axes would, eventually, look at the map and ask a question. The question was, how did the tank get there? If the answer was the drainage channel, and a competent map reading in adequate light would suggest it as the only viable unregistered approach, then the drainage channel was no longer an asset. It was a liability. A known entry point is a known exit point, and an enemy that controls your exit point controls your options. At approximately 2,215 hours, Kravchenko had heard, briefly and at the edge of audible range, the sound of a tracked vehicle moving at low speed south of the junction, not on the road, across open ground, moving without lights. The sound lasted 40 seconds before the wind direction shifted and canceled it. 40 seconds of low-speed tracked movement at an estimated distance of 600 to 800 meters south. He did not radio the observation, he held it. The standard response to encirclement, or the early stages of it, is movement. A tank commander who identifies a closing third element moves to break contact before the geometry becomes inescapable. Every armored doctrine of the period, Soviet and German alike, prioritized maintaining freedom of movement over holding a fixed position under three-axis pressure. Kravchenko did not move. He sat with the information for 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the Panzer IV to the west remained stationary, the ridgeline element remained silent, and the southern presence, if it was what he assessed it to be, continued its approach at a pace designed not to be heard. What he was doing during those 11 minutes was not waiting. He was constructing the German commander's decision tree from the outside. The three-point encirclement only functions if the encircled element behaves predictably. Predictable behavior in this context meant one of two responses: aggressive action against the most visible threat to create an exit corridor, or positional retreat northward away from the southern closing element. Both responses required the Soviet tank to move. Both movements would produce exactly what 2 hours of pressure had failed to produce: a located, moving target, illuminated by firelight, committed to a direction. The trap was not the three vehicles. The trap was the pressure designed to make him choose. Kravchenko's decision was to refuse the choice entirely. At almost 11 p.m., he ordered Ostrenko to move the tank, not toward any of the three threat vectors. Laterally, due east, 90 meters, at minimum engine RPM, using the lowest gear available, at a speed that generated less acoustic signature than the burning structure to the north. He stopped at a position he had identified during his terrain study 6 weeks earlier. A shallow depression, not the drainage channel, not the fold he had used for the false muzzle flash. A third feature, a collapsed agricultural irrigation cut, running perpendicular to the junction's eastern edge. Deep enough to sit hull down, oriented south. He was now facing the drainage channel's northern exit point from a position the German commander's map did not account for. The western Panzer IV was to his left at approximately 350 meters. The ridgeline element was to his upper left at approximately 500 meters. The southern element, if it was entering the drainage channel, would emerge approximately 180 meters directly ahead. He had no armor-piercing rounds. He had 14 high-explosive rounds and a position the German three-point plan had not included in its geometry. The encirclement had been designed to catch a tank defending forward. Kravchenko was no longer defending forward. He was sitting behind the seam of the German plan, waiting for it to arrive. The southern element entered the junction area from the drainage channel exit point. One Panzer IV, moving at low speed, crew heads visible in the open hatches. The posture of a vehicle that believed it was entering an uncontested approach lane. Kravchenko engaged it at 160 meters with high explosive, targeting the exposed deck and crew positions. At 160 meters, high explosive against open hatches is not an armor problem. It is a personnel problem. The vehicle stopped. It did not fire. The Western Panzer IV began moving forward. The encirclement's trigger response to contact on the southern axis. It was now moving toward a junction where the Soviet tank was not where it had last been observed, in a direction that brought it across the burning structure's light line. Kravchenko engaged it at 220 meters. High explosive, engine compartment. Rear hull. The vehicle lost power and drifted left off the road. It was not destroyed. It was stopped. The ridgeline element did not advance. 3 coordinated elements. 1 functioning plan. Kravchenko had let the plan arrive, stepped outside its geometry, and engaged it from the one angle it had not prepared for. The junction was still held. The German forward commander had spent 2 hours and 4 vehicles, and had not moved his line forward by a single meter. But a German armored division does not absorb 4 vehicle losses at a secondary objective and reconsider its timeline. It escalates, and what the 9th Panzer Division sent next was not a probe, not a fixing operation, and not a 3-point encirclement. It was a directive to end the problem at Ponneri before first light, whatever the cost. At 12 a.m. on July 6th, the German directive reached the forward element at Ponneri. It was not transmitted by radio. A dispatch rider delivered it, which meant the content was considered too operationally sensitive for open frequency. That detail alone indicated the level at which the decision had been made. This was no longer a company-level clearance problem. It had moved up. The new order assigned 3 additional Panzer IVs to the junction axis, supported by a motorized infantry element of approximately 40 men, with instructions to clear the position before 4 a.m. 4 hours before the Soviet reinforcement column's estimated arrival window. The timing was deliberate. The Germans had either intercepted or correctly estimated the Soviet timeline, and they were building a 2-hour buffer into their clearance operation. Kravchenko had 11 high explosive rounds, 1 partially fouled spark plug in the engine that Ostrenko had flagged at last check, a gun sight requiring manual correction, and a crew that had been inside a tank for over 6 hours. He had no armor-piercing ammunition. He had no communication with his battalion. He had no updated intelligence on the reinforcement column's actual position. What he had was the junction, the ground beneath it, and everything he knew about both. The motorized infantry arrived first. This was deliberate infantry before armor, designed to clear the dead ground around the junction that tanks cannot safely enter without eyes ahead of them. 40 men, moving in dispersed formation from the western approach, using the road craters from the earlier artillery as covered positions to advance by bounds. Infantry against a tank in open ground is a managed problem. Infantry against a tank in close terrain, at night, with the tank's position unknown, that is a different equation entirely. Kravchenko did not engage the infantry. He let them enter the junction area. He let them move through it. He let them establish that the position appeared, from their vantage point, to be empty, because from their vantage point it was. He was 140 meters east of the junction's center, hull down in the irrigation cut, engine at idle, no lights, no radio, no movement. The infantry cleared the junction in 11 minutes and signaled the armor forward. The 3 Panzer IVs entered the junction. Area at 0041 hours, spaced at 40-meter intervals, moving in column. The formation of a unit that has been told the route is clear. The lead vehicle passed the burning structure's remnants. The second vehicle crossed the road crater. The third vehicle entered the junction's eastern edge. At that point, all 3 were inside 200 meters. Kravchenko fired. He engaged the rear vehicle first. blocking the column's withdrawal. Then the lead vehicle, removing forward momentum. The middle vehicle attempted to turn and presented its thinner side armor to a high explosive round at 90 meters. 3 vehicles, 7 rounds, 90 seconds. The infantry, now inside the junction area, with 3 burning tanks and no visibility, did not advance further. They pulled back to the western road and did not return. At 12:49 a.m., the junction was silent. Kravchenko had 4 rounds remaining. The reinforcement column arrived at 5:37 a.m., 17 minutes past the outer edge of the estimated window. The column commander, a major whose name appears in the record without further detail, reported finding one T-34 parked at the eastern edge of the Ponyri junction. Engine running, no visible crew outside the vehicle. 7 destroyed or disabled German armored vehicles within a 400-meter radius. Junction infrastructure damaged but intact. Rail line uncut. Kravchenko's after-action report was 4 paragraphs. It listed ammunition expenditure, vehicle positions, engagement times, and outcomes. It did not editorialize. It did not explain the decisions. It described what had occurred in the same tone that a maintenance log describes a parts replacement. The report was received, reviewed, and filed. 3 weeks later, without ceremony, without announcement to the company, Kravchenko was promoted to captain. The promotion order cited, demonstrated tactical competence under isolated conditions. 1 line, standard language. Major Rudenko. The same commander who had twice recommended Kravchenko for reassignment to logistics, signed the order. He did not add a note. He did not need to. The German 9th Panzer Division's operational log for July 6th listed the Ponyri Junction delay as a contributing factor to its failure to meet the morning's phase line. 1 tank, 1 junction, 11 hours. It rated 4 sentences in a document covering an entire division's movement. 4 sentences was enough. Kravchenko was given a new tank the following week, a model 1943 variant, the newest available in the battalion. It was assigned to him without a formal request being submitted. Nobody said anything about that either. A man the system had marked as unfit for independent command held a critical junction alone through an entire night, with no support, no communication, and no armor-piercing ammunition in the final hours. And the only record he left was 4 paragraphs and a requisition form. So here's the question: how many Kravchenkos were there? Men the system dismissed, commanders the records barely mention, whose decisions changed the outcome of battle's history, credited to someone else entirely.